Every life comes to a crossroads where one single decision changes everything forever. We follow the paths of those who dared to choose differently, for better or for worse. Subscribe now to explore the many turns of fate in our latest videos.
The conference room on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Chicago skyline. I used to love that view. I'd stand there with my morning coffee before anyone else arrived and watch the city wake up, the lake turning silver in the early light. That morning, I stood in the same spot and poured water into a glass for a client who didn't bother to look at me when he took it. My husband was laughing at something on the other end of the table. That particular laugh, the one that started low and rolled out slow, like he wanted everyone to notice he was the kind of man who laughed easily. I used to find it charming. 7 years has a way of changing what you find charming. Don't mind her, he said, waving a hand in my direction without turning around. She handles the hospitality side of things. Keeps the office running smoothly. He paused, then added, and this is the part I'll never forget, the part that the room heard clearly. The part that 2 of his junior associates would later tell me they were embarrassed to have witnessed. She's good at that. Pretty face, keeps the clients comfortable. You know how it is. The client, a man named Arthur Kellner from a real estate firm out of Phoenix, looked at me then, not the way my husband expected him to. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out if they know something you know. He set down the water glass. Interesting, he said quietly, considering she's the one who approved our account. The room went very still. I picked up the carafe, walked back to my end of the table, and sat down in the chair that had my name on the agenda. The chair my husband had moved the nameplate from 3 weeks ago and replaced with his own. I'd had the building manager quietly swap it back that morning. I looked at my husband. He looked at me, and I said, with the same tone I used to use when I was teaching contracts law to second-year students at Northwestern, "Should we get started?" His name was Trevor. Trevor Allen Marsh. I met him when I was 31, 2 years out of a junior partnership track that had burned me out completely, and 3 months into building something of my own that I hadn't told anyone about yet. I was at a conference in Seattle, not because I wanted to be there, but because my former mentor had asked me to sit on a panel, and I still couldn't say no to her. Trevor was in the audience. He came up afterward and said my segment was the only one worth staying for. He had that easy confidence, the kind that reads as warmth until you've known someone long enough to understand it's actually just comfort. The comfort of a man who has never once been told he wasn't the most important person in the room. I thought it was warmth. We dated for 2 years. I was careful, the way you're careful when you've watched your own mother sign over her business to a man who just wanted to help. I kept my professional life separate. I talked to my attorney, Gretchen, about structure and protection, and what it means to build something you intend to protect. I thought I was being smart. What I didn't account for was how slowly it happens. How by the time you notice the shape of what's occurring, it's already been occurring for years. The company was called Hartwell Advisory. I started it with $40,000 I'd saved from my years at the firm, a short-term lease on a 2-room office in the West Loop, and a single client I'd kept through the transition, a mid-size logistics company that needed restructuring guidance and trusted me enough to follow me out of a partnership that no longer deserved them. By the time I married Trevor, Hartwell had 12 employees, 3 anchor clients, and a reputation in the restructuring space that had taken me 4 years of 18-hour days to build. I was proud of it the way you're proud of something that cost you something real. Trevor had spent those same years in corporate consulting. He was good at it. Not exceptional, but good. He understood the language of boardrooms. He dressed well, spoke well, remembered names. When he suggested, 6 months after our wedding, that he might benefit the firm by coming on in the senior advisory capacity, I heard it the way he said it, as a question. Something we'd discuss. Something I had final say over. I said yes, because at the time it seemed like it would make him happy, and I was still, at that point, in the business of trying to make him happy. It didn't happen overnight, is what I want people to understand. It happened the way water moves through rock. Slowly, consistently, without any single moment you can point to and say there. That's when everything changed. First it was the way he'd speak over me in meetings with vendors. Not obviously, just finishing my sentences, redirecting a point I was making, adding what my wife means is, as though what I'd said hadn't been perfectly clear. Then it was the client dinners he'd schedule without telling me, where he'd present himself as the decision maker and I would find out afterward, from the client's assistant, that they'd been surprised I wasn't there. Then it was the office layout. He said the corner office would be better used as a conference space. That my existing office, the one I'd chosen, the one that had been mine since the beginning, would be more accessible to staff if I was in it. That his role required the visibility that came with the corner placement. I let him have the corner office. That still bothers me, not because of the room itself, because of what saying yes said to everyone watching. The first time I heard him call me a pretty face, it was at a team lunch about 8 months into his tenure. He was telling a story about a client call he'd handled, one that I had actually initiated, researched, and brought to him to present because I was dealing with a contract deadline that week and needed him to cover. He told it well. The team was laughing. And then, he'd looked at me across the table with this fond, slightly condescending smile and said, "She's the pretty face. I'm the one who does the heavy lifting." Everyone laughed. I smiled. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. The thing about our house was that it became his house the same way the company became his company. My name was on the deed. His presence was in every room. He remodeled the kitchen without asking, said he wanted to surprise me. He replaced furniture I'd had since before we met. Things that I'd chosen, things that were mine, with pieces he'd picked because they were more appropriate for what the space could be. After the conference room incident, after Arthur Kellner's comment, after the room went still, I drove home alone. Trevor had stayed behind. I don't know what he said to the team. I didn't ask. I walked into my kitchen, the kitchen he'd remodeled, poured myself a glass of wine, and stood at the island looking around at a room that was full of things I'd never chosen. He came home 2 hours later. I was still standing there. He walked in, loosened his tie, opened the refrigerator. I watched him take out leftovers, heat them up, sit at the counter. He didn't look at me for a full 3 minutes. Then he said, "Arthur's an odd guy. Don't read into it." He was right, I said. He was out of line. He was right, I said again. I approved that account. I built the client relationship. I structured the entire first phase of their engagement before you'd even met him. Trevor put down his fork. "We're a team, Hannah." And there it was. Hannah. Not, "We built this together," or "Your contributions matter." Just my name, in the tone you use when you want someone to feel like they're being unreasonable. My name, by the way, is Hannah. Hannah Elise Marsh, née Cortland. I'd kept Cortland as my professional name. He'd always thought that was a personal preference. He didn't know that it was also a structural choice, one of several I'd made quietly over the years while he was busy being certain he was the most important person in every room. I found the accounting discrepancy by accident. I was going through our Q3 financials, something I still did myself, every quarter, which Trevor found unnecessary and said so regularly. And there was a line item that didn't match anything in our operational records. Consulting fees, $31,000, paid to an LLC I didn't recognize. I looked up the LLC. It was registered in Delaware, which is normal. The registered agent was a law firm Trevor had used for personal matters years before we married. The managing member wasn't listed publicly, which is also normal. But the address on file was a commercial mailbox on Michigan Avenue, 2 blocks from a co-working space where I knew Trevor sometimes met with an independent contractor named Piper. Piper worked in communications. She'd been brought on at Trevor's recommendation to refresh the firm's public-facing materials. She was 34, good at her job, and had spent the last several months CC'd on emails she had no business being CC'd on. I didn't jump to conclusions. I want to be clear about that. I took the information to Gretchen. Gretchen is the kind of attorney who says very few words, but each one lands exactly where she intends. She looked at the LLC registration, looked at the payment records, looked at me, and said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "About the LLC specifically? 2 weeks. About the larger picture." I looked at my hands. "A while. Then let's talk about what you want the next 12 months to look like." Here is what I want to say to anyone who has sat across from a lawyer and been asked to define what they want. The question feels impossible in the moment, and then, once you start answering it, it becomes the most clarifying thing you've ever done. I didn't want to burn anything down. I want to be honest about that. Part of me, the part that had spent 7 years building this company and still had team members she genuinely cared about, wanted some version of resolution that didn't end in scorched earth. But I also knew that what Trevor had done to Hartwell Advisory, the slow erosion of my role, the repositioning of himself as the face and the force and the decision-maker, the financial irregularities, the way he'd made my own staff uncertain of whether they reported to me or to him, that none of that would fix itself. So we worked, quietly and methodically, over the following 4 months. Gretchen handled the legal architecture. A forensic accountant named Douglas, who had done work for 3 of our clients and trusted me deeply, looked at 18 months of financials. My board advisor, a woman named Frances who had been in my corner since the early days, helped me think through the governance restructuring. Trevor knew none of it. He was busy being important. He had business cards printed with a new title he'd given himself, managing principal, without running it by me. He took a meeting with a potential investor and described himself as co-founder. He told a journalist from a trade publication that the firm had been a family vision from the start. That interview ran on a Thursday. I read it over breakfast. On Friday, I filed the paperwork. The meeting with Arthur Kellner's firm had been on my calendar for 6 weeks. It was a renewal conversation, a big one. Their contract was worth approximately 14% of our annual revenue, and both sides knew it. Trevor had inserted himself into the prep process early, held 2 preliminary calls without me, and told me the week before that he'd take point in the room. I said that was fine. I didn't tell him that I'd already had a separate call with Arthur 2 weeks prior. Not about the contract renewal, about a different matter entirely, one that Arthur, as a long-standing client who had done his own due diligence on Hartwell before signing on years ago, had a right to understand before he renewed. Arthur is the kind of man who does his homework. He'd noticed the title discrepancy. He'd seen the trade publication interview. He'd had his own legal team look at the corporate structure and come back with questions. When I told him what was happening and what I had done about it and what the company would look like going forward, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd like to be in the room when you tell him." I thought about that for a few days. I said yes. Back in the conference room, after I said, "Should we get started?" my husband stared at me for a moment with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something between confusion and the beginning of fear. Arthur opened his folder. His associate passed around a document. Trevor looked down at it. I watched his face as he read. The document was a governance summary, new structure, updated operating agreement, board composition, ownership percentages. All of it perfectly legal, all of it signed and filed, all of it in order. The kind of thing that looks very simple on paper and represents an enormous amount of quiet, careful work underneath. Trevor looked up. "What is this?" "It's the current corporate structure of Hartwell Advisory," I said. "Updated as of 3 weeks ago. You can't." He stopped, started again. "You would have needed board approval." "I have board approval. I have Francis, and I have the 2 independent directors we added in January. You'll notice your advisory seat is still there." "Advisory," he said. "That is your actual role," I said. "It always was." One of his associates, a young man named Cole who had been at the firm for 8 months and who I suspected had been quietly uncomfortable with Trevor's behavior for some time, looked very carefully at his notepad. Arthur said, "I think we should take a short break." Trevor didn't move. "Trevor," I said, "the break is for you. Take it." He left the room. I don't know where he went. One of my assistants told me later that he'd stood in the hallway by the elevators for about 15 minutes, then gone to the men's room, then come back in looking the way people look when they've had to tell their face to do something it didn't want to do. When he came back, Arthur and I had already covered the contract renewal terms. The conversation had been easy, professional, warm in the way that long-standing business relationships are warm when there's genuine mutual respect underneath them. Trevor sat down. He didn't speak for the rest of the meeting. Afterward, when Arthur was leaving, he paused at the door and looked back at Trevor. "For what it's worth," he said, in the mild tone of someone who has decided not to say the sharper thing they're thinking. "She's been the one I've wanted in the room since day one." That evening, Trevor came to my office. He stood in the doorway. My office, not the corner one, the one I'd taken back 2 months prior when the restructuring process made it structurally sensible. And he had the expression of a man who had spent the day deciding which version of this conversation he was going to try to have. I waited. "You did all of this without talking to me," he said. "I did. That's not a partnership." "No," I said, "it isn't. But what we had before wasn't either." He tried a few other angles: the marriage, the team, the optics of what this looked like from the outside. I listened to each one, not because I was uncertain, but because I thought he deserved to be heard even now, even after everything, and because I wanted to be sure, absolutely certain, that I was not doing to him what he had done to me, deciding he didn't need information, deciding I knew better, moving pieces without him knowing. The difference was that my pieces were mine to move. When he finished, I said, "I think you should stay in the Bucktown place for a while. We had a second property there, a 2-bedroom he'd been using as a home office. I'll have Gretchen send over paperwork this week." "Hannah, we both know this has been coming," I said. "I think we've both known for longer than either of us wants to say out loud." He was quiet. Then he said quietly, "I really did think we were building something together." And the strange thing, the thing I wasn't entirely prepared for, was that I believed him, not about the financial irregularities, not about Piper or the LLC or the title he gave himself or the years of small, consistent diminishments, but about that one sentence. In that moment, I believed that part of him had genuinely believed that. People can believe something and still do harm with it. That's one of the harder things to hold. "I know," I said. "Me too for a while." The forensic audit concluded 2 months later. The $31,000 had gone to Piper's LLC, a retainer for communications work that had no deliverables attached to it, no contract language, nothing that would survive scrutiny. Gretchen included it in the divorce filing. Trevor's attorney negotiated. We reached a settlement that I was satisfied with, which is all I'll say about that. Piper left the firm the week the audit findings were shared internally. I didn't ask her to leave. She made that decision herself, which I respected. The team adjusted. There was a difficult month where I had to be very present and very honest about what had happened and what the company was going to look like going forward. Some people were relieved. A few were surprised. One person resigned, which I understood. We hired a new director of client services in the spring, a woman named Anita, who had spent 12 years at a firm in Boston and who asked better questions in her first interview than most people ask in a year. She has her own ideas. She pushes back on mine when she thinks I'm wrong. I find it extraordinary. I still have the view from the 42nd floor. I still come in early sometimes before anyone else and stand at the window with my coffee and watch the city. The corner office is a conference space now. Turns out Trevor wasn't wrong about that part. It does work better as a shared room. I just didn't like the way he went about making it one. Arthur Kellner's firm renewed for another 3 years. He brought 2 referrals in the first 6 months. When I sent him a note thanking him, he wrote back, "You were always the reason we signed. Just took a while for the room to catch up." I have it printed. It's not on my wall, it's in a drawer, because I'm not interested in broadcasting anything. But I take it out sometimes, not often, just when I need to remember that the people paying attention were always paying attention, even when I wasn't sure anyone was. My assistant Jamie asked me recently how I stayed so calm through all of it. The restructuring, the audit, the months of parallel processes running quietly while I showed up to the same office every day and sat in the same meetings. I thought about it for a moment. "I grew up watching my mother lose a business," I said. "I decided when I was about 25 that if anyone was ever going to take something from me, they were going to have to do it loudly, in broad daylight, with documentation. Which meant I needed to make sure all the documentation was mine." Jamie nodded slowly. "That's terrifying." "A little," I said. "Also useful. The last time I saw Trevor was at the closing on the Bucktown property. He looked fine. A little tired. He'd taken a position at a consulting group downtown, senior advisor, which is, genuinely, an appropriate title for him. He's good at what he's good at. I've made my peace with the fact that those 2 things can both be true." He shook my hand at the end. Professional. Brief. The handshake of 2 people who have agreed without saying so to let the past be the past. I took the train back to the office. I had at 2 o'clock, a new client, a mid-size manufacturer out of Milwaukee, that needed help thinking through a complicated subsidiary situation. Their CEO had called me directly, not Trevor, not the main line, me, by name, because a colleague of hers had recommended me specifically. I walked back through the lobby, past the building directory that now listed Hartwell Advisory with my name as managing principal. I took the elevator to 42. I stood at the window for exactly 3 minutes. Then I went to work. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. They expect me to say the divorce, or the audit, or the months of running two parallel realities at once, showing up to the same office every morning while quietly dismantling everything that had been built on top of what was mine. But the hardest part was earlier than any of that. The hardest part was the team lunch where my husband said, "Pretty face," and everyone laughed and I smiled, and then I drove home and sat at my kitchen table and did nothing. Not that night. Not for a long time after that. I've thought a lot about why. And I think it's because there's a particular kind of harm that's designed to make you question your own judgment. Trevor never raised his voice. He never did anything that looked, from the outside, like cruelty. What he did was slower and more precise than that. He created conditions in which my confidence in my own perception was the first thing that went. By the time I heard "pretty face" at that lunch table, part of me had already been trained to think, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Maybe this is just how things work when two people share a professional life. That erosion doesn't happen because you're weak. I want to say that plainly, because I spent too long believing it did. It happens because you're paying attention to the wrong signals. You're watching for dramatic evidence, a lie you can prove, a moment you can point to, when the actual damage is being done in the accumulation of small things that are each individually explainable. What changed for me was deciding to trust the pattern instead of waiting for the proof. Once I started doing that, really doing it, not just saying it, everything that followed had a kind of clarity to it. The forensic accountant. The governance restructuring. The conversation with Arthur before that final meeting, none of it felt like revenge. And I want to be precise about this distinction, because I think it matters. Revenge is about making someone feel what you felt. What I did was about making sure the thing I had built was protected and that the record was accurate and that the people I was responsible to, my team, my clients, myself, had a foundation they could actually stand on. The consequences for Trevor were a byproduct of that, not the goal. And I think that's the difference between acting from clarity and acting from pain. There's also something I've been sitting with about the role of patience. Not the passive kind, not the kind where you wait and hope things resolve themselves, but the active kind. The kind where you are doing the work quietly, consistently, without announcing it, because you understand that the most durable things get built that way. My mother lost her business because she moved too fast, reacted too openly, and gave the people who wanted to take it from her a target to aim at. I made a different choice. I gave them nothing to aim at until there was nothing left to take. I don't think I'm unusually strong. I think I was unusually motivated by what I'd watched happen to her, by what I'd built, by the very specific feeling of standing in a room you created and being treated like a guest. That feeling turned out to be useful. Not comfortable, but useful. Would I tell anyone in a situation that even faintly resembles this one? Document everything. Trust your pattern recognition and find the Gretchens in your life early. The people who ask good questions and then actually wait for your answer. The rest you can figure out as you go.